Okay, good afternoon, everybody. First, an announcement. The team assignments are out. That means that you should check that you're on the team that you expect you're on. And if by some fluke you did not sign your team up, then see the teaching staff as quickly as you can to sort that out. But hopefully you'll be happy with how that turned out. Okay, so today's topic is the second of a pair of lectures on conceptual design. I wonder if I can ask you to close your laptops. Today's purposes are to teach you about some ideas for evaluating concepts. So last time we talked about what concepts are, and you developed some concepts for some particular design problems. And today we're going to address the question of when you're looking at a concept, how do you know whether it does the right thing? How do you know whether it's a good or a bad concept? And this is important because we don't want to always rely on having to try things out. That's actually the way that a lot of software is developed, right? You come up with a concept, you build an application, and then you put it out there and you see whether it works. And that can be an extremely reliable way of finding out whether or not your concept was good to start with, but it's very expensive, so you obviously want to avoid that. You want to have some way of looking at the concept and knowing pretty much immediately whether there's a good chance that that concept is going to work out. Now, this idea of evaluation using heuristics is very well established in usability. And in fact, when we talk about usability next week, I'm going to give you a kind of rapid preview of all the usability heuristics that have been developed over the last 30 years or so for user interface design. So that's a really well-established field. And people have come up with all these, by now, very familiar ideas for how to evaluate a user interface. But concepts are something rather different, and there have not been suggestions until now for how to evaluate concepts. And so these heuristics that I'm teaching you today are new. They're ones that come out of my research, but nevertheless, I believe both that they work and that they're actually pretty straightforward in the sense that when you see them, I hope you'll nod your head and say, yeah, that makes sense. That's in line with the way people actually design these kinds of things. So these heuristics, like concepts themselves, are really an attempt to capture the kind of experience and wisdom that great designers have, and to give you a shortcut to obtaining that skill yourself. And the key ideas are the mapping between concepts and purposes. And there's going to be a funny little surprise there. There's one part of that which is going to be very counterintuitive, but I'm going to try and persuade you is actually right. The second thing is the notion of uniformity as a criterion within a concept. And then I'm going to talk about generics and the importance of generics. If I have time, I hope I will. Oh, I should add that to my list. Generics. And by generics, I mean generic concepts that can be used in many different contexts. Okay, at the end of last lecture, I promised that I was going to play you a comedy skit in this lecture. So here it is. This is my favorite British comedy duo called Mitchell and Webb. They've been performing for a long time. And if you get a chance to listen to any of their skits, you can find a lot of them on YouTube. I think they're really clever and funny. But this one caught my eye because this is really about software development, even though they don't know it. It's really about software development, and it's especially about concepts. And I think as you listen to this, it's obviously a joke, but I want you to ponder for yourself whether or not you believe the argument that's being made. Okay? So here it is.
Do you know it's actually impossible to buy a mobile phone without a camera in it now?
That's absolutely ridiculous.
I know. I mean, I have a camera, rather a nice new digital camera. And if I want to take photographs, that is what I shall use. Not an inferior version that happens to be attached to my phone, with which I may be attempting to make a call to chat to someone about the very moment of happiness, drama, or everyday good fellowship that I am also attempting visually to capture.
Quite. I had exactly the same problem when I came to buy my microwave. I literally could not find one that did not also have a clock on it. I said, I understand that it should have a timer. That is integral to its function. But a clock to tell me the time of day, regardless of its relation to what I'm cooking, and whether or not it's nearly done, mocking me for my eccentric meal times, what on earth is the point?
Indeed. For the time, I have my watch, of which I'm extremely proud, it being the only one I could find that didn't also force on me superfluous information, such as the date. Let it tell me the time alone, I said to the man. For the date, I have a rather fine calendar. The only one I could find that wasn't attached to photographs depicting an idealized version of what the weather may be like at that time of year.
Indeed. I wouldn't own a barometer if I intended my calendar to inform me of the weather. My rather fine barometer, with the bit off the top containing a thermometer snapped off and destroyed.
I had exactly the same problem when purchasing my car. I require a means of transport, not a sitting room on wheels, I said to the man. Radio and CD player having been dispensed with, what on earth, I went on to ask, has it got a heater for? Regulation of temperature is no business of a means of transport, covering up for its own failure to achieve its destination with pernicious yet assuaging warmth.
Indeed. A car is for driving to places. If I wish to be warmed on the way, I'll do what I've always done and burn remaindered copies of my autobiography on the back seat.
Who wouldn't?
Furthermore, let those who find the sensation of air rushing towards them at 70 miles an hour somehow beneath them buy windscreens, rather than the rest of us have them foisted upon us.
I like you. Shall we go for a drink?
Only if we can buy it somewhere where they don't also do food, seating, warmth, sky television, and ashtrays.
Indeed not. We shall do what I always do. Buy it at the offie and drink it in the park.
Capital.
So these guys are really design fundamentalists, right? Because there is an underlying philosophy that they're espousing here, which is that every designed artifact should satisfy exactly one purpose, and that it is somehow a corruption of the purity of the design to satisfy two purposes, such as having a car which is not only a means of transportation, but also provides warmth in the cabin. It's obvious that they don't live in New England in the winter, right? But this is actually a very provocative question that I want you to think about today, right? Which is there really something to this idea of unity of purpose, or is it just crazy? And my contention will be that actually unity of purpose is very important, and it's often the key to successful products. They simply take it to an extreme. It also will turn out that for concepts in particular, unity of purpose has a particular significance, and that if you want to build a product with multiple purposes, you can deliver that by having multiple concepts for those purposes. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to show you a concept design that is flawed, okay? And I want you to think about what's wrong with this, because I'm going to ask you as an exercise in a few minutes to diagnose the nature of the flaw, okay? So I want you to sort of put on your design theory hats, and I don't want to know what's wrong with it in terms of why a user wouldn't like it, because I'm hoping to make that very clear to you why a user wouldn't like this, right? I want you to figure out what's the underlying problem, what's the sort of general problem that could be inferred, that could be applied in other similar scenarios, okay? So here's the flawed concept design. So I'm very keen on photography, and I don't know, 5 years or so ago, I got this fantastic camera, which was the Fuji's camera, which was a huge success. I mean, it was a success for all kinds of aesthetic reasons, because Fuji sort of nailed this, this retro aesthetic, this Leica-like look, but they packed it with quite amazing technology. If you're a camera geek, the thing you need to know about this camera, which is really amazing, is they made a fantastic viewfinder. They made a viewfinder that was both visual, with sort of like a heads-up display with stuff projected onto it, but at the click of a little button, actually that little red lever, you could turn it into an LCD display and actually see the real image. So it was very cool. However, as is often the case for these kinds of consumer electronic devices, somehow the companies that produce them don't produce software which is of the same quality as the physical device and all of its characteristics. Right? So I think when we think about software design, the kinds of companies that we're most familiar with are Apple, Microsoft, Google, and so on, right? Facebook. And these are very software-focused companies that have a lot of experience in designing software. That's not to say they always do it perfectly, but somehow software design that produces sort of super usable, robust, easy-to-understand designs seems to come less frequently for the manufacturers of cameras, printers, and things like that. So I'm going to show you one particular quite interesting problem with this camera. And it's not, by the way, just a problem with this camera. Fuji have pretty much repeated this problem in all their products. And it's kind of a surprising problem. So here's the issue. there is a menu that allows you to choose what's called the image quality, okay? And all this does is determine whether or not you're going to record in RAW format, meaning all the sensor data, or in JPEG format, or both. So RAW means just RAW, of course, and like fine plus RAW means a fine quality JPEG in combination with the RAW. You store two files, okay? So I can change that, for example, to fine plus RAW. So now I'm in fine plus RAW mode, and I'm looking through the camera. This is, happens to be my favorite photographic subject, one of my favorite photographic subjects, my lovely daughter. I better be careful because I have more than one child, so she's not my favorite. And here's one of the cool things you can do with this camera. If you want to take a photo like this, you can just use the default mode. But if you want to take sort of Instagram-like photos, you can do that too. So here's a photo in an Instagram ratio of 1:1, a square, okay? So how do you do that? Well, you do that in a different menu. And if you look at that menu, you'll see that the default is 3:2. Can you see at the top there? And I can switch from 3:2 to 1:1. And now, having done that, I'm in the 1:1 ratio. And now you can see the combination of features that I have set. I'm in 1:1, and I'm in fine plus RAW. Okay? So that should all make sense. Now, here's the question. The question is, what happens if I go back to the image quality setting and I change it to RAW? What's going to happen? Well, if you don't know this camera, you won't be able to guess. But I'll tell you what happens. This is what happens. Do you see that it's sort of grayed out the image size setting, and it's written in, it's put the little RAW symbol there. And so I've actually lost my 1:1 setting. So now I'm back to taking photos in 3:2 mode. So why do you think this might be the case? What's the rationale for this decision? Yeah, Jackson. Exactly. If you're only saving in RAW, right, presumably you're saving all the sensor data regardless, right? And so this piece of functionality really only makes sense in JPEG, right? Because it's a functionality that crops the photograph. And you don't want to crop the RAW image, right? You want all of it. You only want to crop the JPEG. So if you don't have it set to JPEG, it doesn't make sense to have this feature. Okay? Well, that would be a plausible argument, but it turns out that that's not actually true, somewhat surprisingly. So there's a very good reason to want to take RAWs with this aspect ratio, and that is that if you actually take a photo in RAW and JPEG, then of course, as you'd expect, the JPEG photo is going to be cropped into a square, so it won't have any pixels outside that square. But the RAW photo will look like this. And I don't know if you can see, but I'm looking at this photo in a photo editing program, and can you see that the RAW image extends beyond the square? It's just been sort of darkened out on the sides. So what the camera has actually done is the best possible thing, which is that it's actually imposed a crop, a non-destructive crop, in the metadata of the RAW image. And I can accept that crop, or I can actually move it around if I want to, or I can delete that crop and be back to the whole image. So this is giving me, essentially I can have my cake and eat it, right? I can pre-visualize in the camera, and I can get my square, and the square, exactly where I chose it, will be recorded in the RAW image. And then if I decide I don't want it, I could just delete that crop, and I'll be back to the whole image. So the people who designed the image processing pipeline of this camera got it exactly right. But the people who designed the user interface have somehow messed up, because they're going to force me now, if I want these images to look like this, I have to take a JPEG and throw it away. Right? Now, you might be saying to yourself, well, come on, big deal. But it actually is a big deal, because it's an accumulation of many little design flaws like this that can determine whether or not a product is actually usable or not, right? Whether or not you actually love it or don't love it. OK, so much for that. So I'm going to talk now about generalities, and then in a minute we'll come back to this problem. So here's the general contention. The contention that I make, and it's a very provocative one, is that purposes and concepts should be in one-to-one mapping. Okay? So for every concept, you should have a purpose, and for every purpose, you want to fulfill in your application to have a concept, and they should never cross over. So what does that mean? Well, it means that the following bad things shouldn't happen. Now, I'm hoping that several of these will be pretty obvious to you, right? Obviously, you don't want to have a purpose that has no concept, right? So I'm not actually going to give you examples of this in detail, but I can just mention one or two. The most egregious one that always bothers me in my life is that email does not have a concept of a correspondent or a user, right? We all want this. We'd all like to know who we're talking to, right? But no email system provides this. And the real problem is because it would require some kind of public key infrastructure or something like that to really know who you're talking to. And it would require much better software that could somehow keep track of all the email addresses, you know, that Megan uses when she sends email to Jackson, right? So that he can actually say, you know, I'd like to see messages from Megan, right? Rather than messages from, you know, m@mit.edu or whatever, right? But this is not a feature that email systems provide. So there's an obvious purpose here. Tell me who I'm talking to, right? And email clients don't provide this. There is no concept. The concept might be called, you know, correspondent or user, and it's just missing. And people for decades have talked about how nice it would be to have this concept, right? It would get rid of spam as well, right? But it's not there. Going down, unmotivated concepts. Obviously, you don't want to have a concept that has no purpose. Right? Why would you not want that? Yes, Adrian. Yeah, it's just clutter in the user interface. It's extra work to do in the implementation, right? So pretty much people don't do this, right? They sometimes sort of do it frivolously. You know, one of the most famous examples of this is perhaps Facebook's poke concept, right? Where when they introduced it, they actually said, we don't really know what this is for, but here it is. So these on the left are pretty uncontroversial, right? So going round, the one on the bottom right, redundant concepts. This is pretty straightforward too, right? The problem here is that you have one purpose that you want to fulfill, but you have two different concepts fulfilling that purpose. And again, there's sort of an obvious sort of waste of effort here, right? Because if one of them fulfills the purpose, then why did you introduce another one? Not only is it going to be work to build it, but it's going to confuse the user who won't understand why there seem to be two different concepts for the same purpose. And I'm going to give you an example of that later. Now, the final one is the controversial one. And this is the one that I never thought made any sense at all until I looked at a lot of examples, studied a lot of systems, and tried to understand what goes wrong very frequently in conceptual design. And that's the idea that a concept should not be overloaded in the sense that one concept attempts to satisfy multiple purposes. And the reason for this, in short, is that typically you can't do two things well. Pretty much you can only do one thing well. And that if you want to do a second thing, you really need a second concept. And you might say, well, can't you sometimes design the concept so well that it does these two different things? The answer is generally no. And it generally causes trouble. So I'm going to give you a whole bunch of examples of that. But what I want you to do, first of all, is I want you to consider these 4 ways to fail, okay? And I want you to look at oops, sorry, don't know why those are like that. I want you to look at the example that I just showed you. I want you to think about that. And I want you to, talking to the person next to you, I want you to think about what are the fundamental concepts that are being offered in this user interface, the concepts that are being projected, offered to the user. What are the purposes that the user would like to actually have fulfilled with these concepts? And what is going wrong in the relationship in this question of correspondence between concepts and purposes? Okay? Is the question clear to everyone? Yeah? All right, so let's do that for a couple of minutes. So when I say what are the concepts, you know, obviously, well, it's not obvious, but I'll tell you, you just need to write down a name, right? You don't need to do anything more. I'm not asking you to describe the concept in any way. Just give a name to the concept and write it down. Okay? So we're looking for 2 names for concepts, and you know, or some number, and some number of purposes. And a purpose is probably going to be more than 1 word, right? It's going to be a couple of words explaining what you're trying to fulfill. Okay, so this might be something For those of you who aren't sort of deep into photography, something that might help you here, the difference between, if you look at the image size menu, the L and M there mean large and medium, and they refer to the number of pixels in the image, right? The image quality menu is to do with the compression, how much compression is done in the JPEG. So it doesn't affect the resolution in the JPEG, it just determines how cranked up, how lossy the compression is. Is that a hand about to go up? Yes. It's Ayush.
Yeah, so the two concepts are being able to adjust the aspect ratio of an image.
But that's, I think, are you confusing concepts and purposes?
Oh, right, sorry, yeah. I meant,
Yeah.
that was purpose.
That's a purpose, good.
The concept would be the image quality setting
Yep.
and the image size setting.
Great. So Ayush has correctly told us there are two concepts, quality and size. Okay, so those are the two concepts. What are the purposes? Is it Julia? Yeah. Yes.
I thought it was like to reduce the editing stuff after
To reduce the?
editing steps after taking it.
Good. So that's what I'm calling the aspect ratio, yes? Is that what you meant? Being able to choose the ratio? Not having to crop it afterwards?
Yeah, so like crop it yourself later on.
Process it for what?
I'm sorry?
You don't have to process it for what, though? You said you don't have to process it afterwards. That's correct. But what do you not want to process it for? For the aspect ratio, that's right. Because there might be other things you do, like change the quality. And by the way, it's not just, I'm going to call it aspect ratio as the purpose. It's not just, Julia's right, it's basically, it's basically saving the effort of post-processing. And it's also being able to preview in 1.1, say. Okay, so notice, by the way, I'm going to claim that this is one purpose. It's one purpose because these things really go together. They have the same goal, which is wanting to take square photos, right? So just because I express a purpose, with multiple bullet points doesn't make it multiple purposes. So that's good. What's another purpose here? What's another purpose that these concepts provide? Yes, Julia. That's actually true. Yes. Very good. Let's say to choose the file types. Is there another purpose? Is it Michael? To crop an image is really the aspect ratio. That's what I had in mind for the aspect ratio one. But yes. Costa? To choose how much storage a file takes, sure. It's sort of, we could call it the quality, size ratio, right? Good. So let's stick with that for now. Let's say we have these three purposes and these two concepts. Well, you can see we're already in trouble, right? Because we're not going to get a one-to-one mapping out of this. So how are these actually related? How do you choose the file types? Yeah, thank you, Megan. You choose it there in the quality setting. How do you choose the quality size ratio? This one's pretty awkward, right? Because actually, if you just look at the JPEG quality, you choose it partly with the compression ratio in the quality setting, and you choose it partly in the size that determines the number of pixels. Okay? What about the aspect ratio? Where is that? What concept or concepts fulfill that purpose? Yes, size, exactly. Remind me of your name? Hussam, thank you. So the aspect ratio is determined by the size. Okay. So now you can see that we actually have a whole bunch of problems here, right? I would claim the more minor problem, which actually I hadn't anticipated someone pointing out, but it's an interesting one, is that if you're regarding choosing the file types as a separate purpose, you know, it is a little bit ugly that gets munged in with the quality size ratio, right, in the image quality menu by having these funny combinations. And if you imagine, if you had like a third kind of file you could store, right, like this new image thing that, you know, that Apple is now using in iPhones, right, then you'd now get the Cartesian product of 3 types. So this menu is not actually viable as soon as you have more than 2 file types. So there is potentially a real design problem there, the fact that this concept here of quality is serving both of these. But this one is also a problem, right? The fact that the size is really doing 2 things. And this is the source of the difficulty that I described. And it's because the size is essentially associated with the quality size ratio that what they did was they said, well, we already have something that chooses pixel counts, right? We do that for JPEG images. So if we're going to let you choose the aspect ratio, well, that's just like choosing a pixel count. It's like saying I want, rather than 300 by 200, I want 200 by 200. So what they did was they slipped in this aspect ratio into the same menu, into the same concept as size, right? And that's why you have this weird menu that has, you see, the aspect ratios and then the large, medium, small setting. Again, they formed the Cartesian product because they've tried to deliver both purposes at the same time. Okay? Who understands this? Pretty much everyone? Half the people here? Who has a question? Who finds this a little puzzling? Okay, let's have ask a question.
So to me, it seems like the third purpose, quality size ratio, is just a result of the previous 2 purposes, right? The file type and the aspect ratio sort of determines your quality size.
Oh, actually it doesn't, no, you see, because that's why you have large, medium, and small. Because just because you've determined it's going to be 2 by 3, it could be 200 by 300, or it could be 400 by 600. That's why you have so many settings in that menu. Because you get to choose not only the aspect ratio, but also the number of pixels on each side, right? Good question. Other questions? Is it Jocelyn? Dev? Sorry, say it again? Jasmine, sorry.
Wouldn't the quality also affect the aspect ratio? Like when you change it to raw, it changed the aspect ratio to a 3:2?
That's a very good point. So Jasmine points out that indeed the quality affects the aspect ratio, but that's sort of an artifact of this awkward design, right? What we're trying to do here is simply say which concept is attempting to fulfill which purpose. And the quality has nothing to do with the aspect ratio, but you're absolutely right. The consequence of the aspect ratio and this getting coupled through the size has meant now that aspect ratios become associated with JPEGs, because this quality size ratio is just a JPEG property, right? And so what we've done is we've now coupled them together, and now suddenly, because quality also determines the file type, now everything is all coupled together, okay? So what I hope you can see here is that actually, if they're just separated each of these purposes into its own concept, right, it would have produced a much easier and more powerful user interface, right? So that's the very straightforward idea. It's like, write down your purposes and make sure that each purpose gets its own concept. And if you want to try and deliver 2 purposes with 1 concept, then think really carefully about it, because you've got a risk of really messing up. And that's what they did here, right? Okay. Who understands where this is going? I'm getting about half of you, so I'm getting some people are confused. Another question? What would help? Seeing more examples? Who thinks seeing more examples would help? All right, good. So why don't you close your laptops, and I'll show you some more examples. So let me illustrate some more examples of these overloaded concepts, and I divide them into the following categories: piggybacking, false convergence, emergent purpose, and denial. So this example was piggybacking, right? Because the image size concept, what I'm imagining is that when they wanted to add aspect ratio, someone said, we've already got that menu that gives you the number of pixels in each dimension. Let's throw it in there, right? And nobody said, but wait a minute, that menu is just for JPEGs. That's going to mess things up. They didn't do that, right? They piggybacked it. Let me show you a much worse piggybacking. Again, in a consumer electronics device, this is what the Epson printer driver looks like on the Mac. Now, can you see there's a paper size dialog there where you can choose the paper size? What other options do you think I'm going to have there? Yeah, A4 and so on. Let me show you, in fact, so I have those options. But then notice you see under US letter, I have multiple child options for US letter. Here they are. So what's going on? Can anyone explain what's going on? What are these and why do they make sense? Jackson. Exactly. They've combined the choice of paper size with how the paper is fed to the printer. And again, my guess is because they didn't want to create their own custom printer driver or to customize the Apple printer driver, they thought, hey, here's a really cool hack, right? We can get the paper feed into a special paper size setting. Okay, question for you. Do you think that works out well or badly? So, you know the answer to this, right? It doesn't work out well. So, and you know, I could give you lots of examples of how it doesn't work out well, but just think of the fact that often in a document, you have a preset, you choose the size of the sheet of paper, right? Well, having said that, that now determines where you're going, which side of the printer you're going to print it from, right? So it turns out that using this printer driver, you have to change your page preset, your page setup, if you actually want to print, you know, from the back of the printer or the front of the printer, right? And it creates a whole load of problems. Here's another example of overloading. I call this false convergence. And what false convergence means is that when you looked at two purposes, you sort of thought they were the same. So if you ask the question, what is friending in Facebook for, I would claim that it has two purposes, right? One is filtering incoming posts, okay? I only want to see Julio's posts, because I know he's a really smart guy and has interesting Facebook posts. But you know, I don't want to see all the other posts in the world. That's one use of friending. Another use is that I want to control access to my posts. I don't want everyone in the world to see my posts. Now, under the assumption that you have entirely symmetric relationships with your friends, right? These are, in fact, very nicely aligned, these purposes. But if you have any friends where you would like them to see your stuff, but you don't want to see their stuff, or vice versa, this is not a good, this is a false convergence. These purposes don't work together. And that's why some social media systems have a separate purpose. They have following for the purpose of filtering incoming posts, and they have friending for controlling access. And sure enough, Facebook eventually found a need to add following itself, and it did that. This is a category that I call emergent purpose. This is where a concept has one very clear purpose that makes sense, but over time, people add other purposes to it, sometimes to disastrous effect. So this is just a really trivial example, but think about the purpose of a subject field in an email message, right? So the initial purpose was to summarize the content, so you don't need to read the message to know what it's about. Makes perfect sense, right? Unfortunately, people added other stuff. So one of them was, when listservs came about, right, people thought it would be really helpful to put the name of the listserv in the subject field, so you could see immediately it was from a listserv without having to look at the to field, right? So we've got a whole load of concept-purpose mixing going on here. And that produces some weird outcomes. One of them that a friend of mine pointed out that burnt him once is that if you BCC a list, right, hoping that the people on that list won't know that they were BCC'd, because that's the whole purpose of BCCing, right? Then in fact, the subject field will reveal that you BCC'd the list, okay? Because everyone on the list gets that information. And here's a final one from Gmail. This is one that one of my PhD students pointed out to me. He noticed that Gmail groups conversations based on the subject line. And he was getting a lot of messages from, I don't know, Expedia or Travelocity that had the subject line, your trip reservation. The consequence was that all his different trips got put into one conversation, but he wanted to separate them into different trips. You know, my trip to San Francisco, my trip to New York, or whatever. Okay, so again, what's happening here is an emergent purpose for the same concept that messes everything up. And the final category is what I call denial. This is a sort of polemical term where software developers insist that if you're a sane person, you can't possibly have that purpose. There must be something wrong with you, not the software, if you have that purpose. And here's an example that I like to illustrate that. So all source control systems like Git or Subversion or whatever have the concept of a commit. And the purpose of a commit is very clear. The purpose of a commit is to mark a coherent point in the development. I've just finished fixing a bug, or I've just finished implementing a feature, right? And the reason for that is that when you look at the graph, you can look at these commit points and you can get coherent snapshots of the repository, okay? But what do people actually do with commits? One of the things they do is because the repo is normally in the cloud, they commit just to save their work, right? It's like, I better commit this, otherwise if my machine goes down, I'll lose this work. So what they do is they actually have a second purpose, which is backup. And of course, the designers of Git and Subversion and so on say, well, you just shouldn't do that. No one in their right mind uses a source code control system to do backup. The fact is everybody does, or lots of people do, right? And so, some people do horrible things like trying to run Dropbox at the same time of your Git repo. You don't do that. OK. So these are all illustrations of overloading. Now what I'd like to do is pose you another little exercise for you to think about to sort of exercise these ideas of the concept purpose mapping. So how many of you are familiar with categories in Gmail? OK, bunch of you. So for those of you who aren't familiar, here's the basic idea. Gmail will sort your incoming email in your inbox into these categories, like your primary category, and then what they call social, which is social media-related things, and promotions, which is basically spam, people trying to sell you things, and some other categories. And you can actually adjust these nice tabs by choosing which of these categories are actually displayed. Now, when this new concept of category came out, which I think was in about 2013 or something, here are some of the things people said. The first thing was they immediately started offering you tips for turning this off, right? And then people started getting angry. Google gets it terribly, terribly wrong with Gmail tabs and makes me angry. The question is, why were people angry? Well, one reason I think they were angry was they didn't really understand what was going on. So the question is, in particular, that a lot of them asked, what is the difference between a category and a label? Remember we talked about labels last time? Right? Why are they different? Aren't categories just a way of labeling messages, right? So if you're a sophisticated user, what do? The first thing you do is you go to Google's own help facilities for an explanation of what a label is, in the hope that you will understand why a label isn't a category. And here's what you'll find. Labels help you organize your messages into categories. Oh dear. So we have a problem here. And this isn't just, don't be misled into thinking this is just some kind of philosophical linguistic problem. It actually has real consequences. You can't, for example, associate tabs, those nice things that divide up your messages into different groups. You can't do that with labels. You also can't create new categories, even though you can create new labels. You can't use these tabs outside the inbox the way you can use labels outside the inbox. And so the key point is that this confusion of categories and labels creates real problems. So I would like you to do, just for the next 3 minutes, the following little exercise. I'd like you to figure out what design rule is violated in this case. Okay? So what is the problem here in the relationship between purposes and concepts? Okay? So again, the answer is going to be extremely simple, but it's a question of just focusing, in a laser-like way on what the difficulty really is. Okay, so why don't we discuss this a little bit? What are the concepts here? Not a trick question. Yes, Costa.
Label.
Yep, label. And category. OK, good. And what are the purposes? Or what's at play here in terms of purposes? Megan? To organize conversations. You mean just organize messages? Yeah. Or actually, you're right. It could be organized conversations, but that's another whole story. So there's a purpose of wanting to organize your conversations. And what is the mapping between, are there any other purposes? No, there aren't any other purposes, right? And so the mapping is like this. One purpose, two concepts, okay? And so that is the source of the problem in this case, right? It's that Gmail confuses the user by delivering essentially the same functionality with two different concepts, okay? And those concepts have weird differences between them, right? They're not completely aligned. Okay, one of them gives you this nice tab layout. One of them can apply to more than the inbox, right? So the two concepts are different. They're not comparable. But they're essentially both providing the same purpose. Any thoughts on this? Can anyone see a justification for this? Because it's possible, actually, this is a good design. Ayush? Great, great. So Ayush has actually pointed out that there was a whole load of new functionality that came with concepts that wasn't there with labels. And that functionality including this ability to organize your messages into tabs. It included the ability to be notified for only certain categories of messages, and other features like that. However, I would claim that there was no reason that those pieces of functionality weren't all essentially related to organizing messages, right? Because notification should be able to rely on the organization of messages. Why can't I say, notify me, when messages have this particular label? I should be able to say that as well, right? And likewise, the tabs, right? Why should I only be able to have tabs when messages are organized by category rather than when messages are organized by label? It seems that tabs are just another way to show my organization of messages. So that's the argument. The argument is that just because you have new functionality doesn't mean you need a new concept. It means that what you should probably do is revisit your existing concepts and try and figure out if that functionality can be supported by those existing concepts. So that was a great observation, Ayush. Thank you. Any other thoughts about this? Anyone else want? Yes. Excellent. Excellent. So Adi is making an interesting observation, which is that in some sense, categories are very different because categories involve an automatic classification of the incoming messages by Google that then puts them into what's essentially these different inboxes. That is exactly true. However, if you look deeply into labels, you'll find that there was already a notion of a system label. So in fact, Gmail was already spontaneously attaching labels. So for example, there is a sent label, right? And the sent label is attached by Gmail, right, without your participation, to messages that have been sent, right? And so the question, so this is exactly the kind of discussion that I would hope the software designers would have. Someone would make exactly Adi's point and say, well, what about system-generated categories? There isn't room for that in labels, is there? And then someone would say, well, wait a minute, we already have system labels. Why can't we use system labels to do that? And then someone else would say, well, wait a minute, but categories are giving us multiple inboxes, right? At that point, I would hope someone might say, well, why do we need a notion of multiple inboxes? Why don't we just regard these as different filterings of the inbox, just the same way you can filter your inbox on labels? And then you come back and say, but I like the tabs. And then I would say, well, if you like the tabs, why didn't you provide the tabs for labels too? So that you could you could organize your messages assigning labels to tabs, okay? So the point here is that there are all kinds of intricate issues going on. But for some reason, they chose to add a new concept. Now, it could be that there was some organizational reason for doing that. Maybe the code for labels was not in a fit state that they wanted to mess with it, right? And maybe they thought it's easier just to add a whole new concept, right? So there might actually have been good business and development reasons for doing this. But for the user, I claim it has no benefit. For the user, it would have been much nicer if their announcement wasn't, we're now giving you categories. It was, we're now giving you really cool automatic labeling, right? And we're going to give you really good control over that automatic labeling. And not only that, we're going to let you use your labels in all kinds of exciting new ways. And instead, what they did was they introduced these two notions, this new notion of category, and now there are all kinds of confusing things, like categories and labels that have the same name. This is possible, right? So it's very confusing. Great. Okay, so now I'd like to talk about what I think is a less controversial property of concepts, and I think this is something that will be very familiar to you. So this is really just giving a name to something that has probably already annoyed you in the design of concepts. So I claim that one of the things that makes a concept really usable in practice is that its operational principle is uniform, right? If you recall, the operational principle is that archetypal scenario. It's what you actually need to do to use the concept. And by uniform, what I basically mean is you always do the same thing, right? When you want to fulfill a particular task, it always looks the same. So let me give you an example of where that's not true. So this is the concept of group, right? So you've all seen this in a million programs. So I can select two different objects, and then I can group them together. What's the purpose, by the way, of this concept? Oh, we're getting sound effects. That's cool. Jonathan.
Be able to manipulate both objects at the same time.
Exactly. It allows you to manipulate both objects at the same time. It actually raises all kinds of subtle questions about what it means to manipulate two objects at the same time. But yes, that's exactly what it does. So we can write a concept description that says, the purpose is to treat a set of objects if they were one object and so on. What's the operational principle? Well, you all know the operational principle, right? It's what I just showed you. It's you select some set of objects, you apply the group action to them, and then you do some mutation to that group, okay? That's the operational principle. However, this doesn't always work. Have any of you ever noticed a case in particular in like a slide presentation app like PowerPoint, where this doesn't work? Maybe you don't have the joy of making enough presentations in PowerPoint or Keynote. Well, I'll tell you, one of the places it doesn't work is that there are certain special objects in slides. And one of them is the text block, typically in a slide, right? The bullet, that thing that says operational principle is uniform at the top. That is just a text object. I can grab it and move it around, but I can't group it. And if you try and group it, you find that there's trouble. The point is that this operational principle is essentially quantified. It's saying this is true for all sets of objects, right? It's quantified not only over the arguments to these operations, in this case a select, but it's quantified over all the states you might start in as well. It says whatever state you're in, pick any set of objects and you can group them. Well, you can't, okay? And that's really annoying. If that set of objects contains a text body object, you're in trouble. Now I'm going to show you another example of this. Let me just live demo time. Isn't this exciting? Don't say you don't see exciting live demos in 6170. I can just figure out how to mirror the displays. Okay, so here's Apple numbers. So this is I think, a really annoying design feature. So, so a lot of MIT professors do consulting, and we make up bills to our clients, right? And so a bill might look like this. It might say, on October the 2nd, I thought really hard, and so I'm billing you $30 for that. Or I'm billing you 3 hours of work, or whatever my hourly rate is, right? And the point is, you write down this list of things, and you list them in order by date, and then at the end of the month or whenever, you compute the total number of hours and you send them a bill, okay? So how do you compute the number of hours? Well, you write some kind of, unfortunately that's not legible, but let me just do it again for you so we can make this a full exciting demo. If I can actually figure out how to do this. Delete. Okay. So I would say, for example, equals, and then I select these things here, press return, and this is the sum of all the things in that range, okay? So this notion of a range is a concept, okay? It's actually a fundamental concept for spreadsheets. What is the purpose? What do you think the purpose of this notion is, of this concept is? Yeah, Jackson. You can operate on sets of similar things. That's right. But there's something particularly important about what ranges provide. The crucial thing they provide is this. If I add a line in the middle like this, right? And I say, actually, I forgot. On October the 2nd, not only did I think hard, but I dreamed for you a little bit as well, right? So I'm going to bill you for the dreaming, and I actually dreamed for 10 hours, right? So notice that that increased my bill from 16 to 26, okay? So that was really nice. So this notion of a range is a flexible notion that actually changes sort of spontaneously. As I add more items within the range just grows or shrinks naturally, okay? So I can give you an operational principle for the range, right? What's the operational principle? It's that you define this thing, and then when you add or remove elements from the range, if you add or remove rows from the range, then the sum or the computed value is updated accordingly, okay? Except it doesn't quite work. Can you guess where it doesn't quite work? Yes, Julia? Yeah.
Not sure, but does it miss out? Like, does it not include the last line?
Exactly. It doesn't include the last line. So if I actually select the last line here, and I add a row below that, and I say, well, after I presented, you know, I did a review, and I spent 100 hours doing the review, no effect. You want to guess where else it doesn't work? Yeah, the top line. The top line doesn't work either, up there, okay? And so what do I actually have to do? I actually have to do, this is, now you might say, I'm sure some of you are thinking, wow, this guy's such a nitpicking pedant. It's like, wow, get over it, right? But this is actually really annoying for the usability of the spreadsheet, because what it actually means is that I have to do something like this. I have to add a row there, okay? So now you can see that my range will include that lower row. Now I can take the contents of this row and paste it up there, and now I can add my new row here, and it will work, okay? But that's really clunky. So, so that's the point. The point is that this could have been designed differently, and here's the unbearable tragedy of this that makes me so sad. The unbearable tragedy is that all you would have to do to get this right is to change the behavior of add row, so that if I selected this bottom line, for example, and said add a row below, then because that line is inside the range, it would add the new row inside the range. But if I selected, for example, there, which is below the range, and added a row above, it would behave differently, because I'm doing it from outside the range, okay? Well, the tragedy of this is exactly what the previous version of numbers did. So somebody figured out this nice design, and sadly, between iWork 09 and the newer version, which added all kinds of cool features, they lost this nice little piece of design that was really significant for the usability of the tool. Okay. So that is the notion of uniformity. Let me give you one other example. Apple Mail does really weird things with conversations. If you grab a conversation like that, and that conversation corresponds to multiple messages on the right-hand side, and you do something natural with that conversation, like moving it to a different folder, what it does depends on what folders those messages started in. So it will, in fact, for example, it will only move the messages that are in the folder that you've selected on the left. So if that conversation has 10 messages, and 5 are in the folder and 5 are in other folders, it only moves 5 of the messages. It's very weird. Okay. And so there are lots of different kinds of non-uniformity. You could see the aspect ratio setting as a kind of non-uniformity. Here's one for Dropbox. Dropbox has this property that you can't make a shared folder if one of its ancestors or descendants is a shared folder. And that turns out to be a very painful restriction that prevents you, for example, from, it would prevent me, for example, from sharing with all of you, a folder that contained lots of material for 6170 and having a subfolder that I asked you to submit stuff to that I made unviewable by the rest of the class. You can't do that because you'd have 2 shared folders, one a child of the other one. You can't have that. Git has all kinds of weird non-uniformities. You can't, how many of you know about branching? So how many of you have had some trouble trying to branch in Git? So a lot of you. So one of the reasons that branching is so hard is that it's so non-uniform, right? The operational principle isn't, if you want to create a new branch, then type the command to create a new branch. It's, if you want to create a new branch, then first make sure that you've actually reconciled all conflicts, right? That's very painful. Why should you reconcile the conflicts before you make a new branch? You want to get on with your work in another branch. You don't want to reconcile your conflicts, but Git won't let you do that. Okay, and the point is that each of these different kinds of non-uniformities are over different aspects, whether it's the argument to an action or the state you're in and so on. Okay, so that's the idea. Any questions about uniformity? Yes, Costa.
So would system labels of Gmail, for example, violate uniformity?
Oh, that's a good question. Why might they violate uniformity?
You can't control them like you can your own labels, and they're still labels.
That's a great question. So Costa says that maybe system labels should violate uniformity because you can't control them like you can control your own labels. And I think that's true. Like, you probably can't attach a sent label to something you didn't send. I think that's true. And actually, that points to a very interesting design issue, which is that sometimes, for good reason, you really do want to violate uniformity. In fact, it's quite a problem in Apple Mail. That is not true. And in Apple Mail, I can move a message to the sent folder even if it was never sent. If you send me a message, I can move it to the sent folder. And that's very confusing, right? And so there is a genuine conflict there between trying to make an application that makes sense on the one hand and give the appropriate meaning to that sent label, and on the other hand, providing uniformity. So that's a fantastic observation. So generally, and this is true, I should say, of all design heuristics, there's always an exception, right? That it's just a heuristic. It's just something that, in the absence of some other consideration, you should try and make true, right? Because you don't want to have all these kinds of non-uniformities. Yes, Kostner?
So how would you remedy that, or would you say that it's a necessary violation?
It's a good question. Would I even try and remedy that? It doesn't seem to me a particular problem that you can't attach. The non-uniformity is quite easily explained, right? Because what I could do is I can split the labels into system labels and user-defined labels. And then the non-uniformity is simply saying that the operational principle applies only to the user-defined labels. So I would say it's not too bad. It's not as intricate as like the Git branching one that requires you to do a lot of work. It just says there's something you can't do. And saying there's something you can't do is generally not so bad if it's something that you really shouldn't want to do. Right? When I said I would want to group text objects, there's a very good reason I might want to do that. For example, I might want to do an animation that makes my main text body object come up with some other object. In fact, that's the reason I normally want to do it and can't do it. It's annoying, right? But I can't think of why you'd want to say this message was sent when in fact it wasn't sent. But again, that's a trade-off, and I think you could come to different decisions on that. Oh, I do want to say that this property of not being able to do something, I mean, that will obviously often happen with permissions. So a common non-uniformity is you can't do something because you can't own it, or because somebody else has a lock on it, or something like that. So those non-uniformities often arise for security reasons. So they can be justifiable, but they have to be carefully justified. Other questions? Yes, Michael?
Yeah. How would you resolve the Git non-uniformity?
Great question. How do you resolve the Git non-uniformity? So actually, I know the answer to that because my wonderful PhD student, Santiago Perez de Rosso, has built a pain-free version of Git called Gitless, Git without the Git. And you can download it and try it, and it resolves a bunch of conceptual design problems, and that is one of the ones that it resolves. And we actually built Gitless as a way we built it several years ago as an experiment to put these design principles in practice, to see if we could analyze something as complex as Git, apply these heuristics to it, and then fix the design so it obeyed the heuristics. So the solution to this particular one is actually to give you multiple working directories. So the reason that the problem arises is you only have one working directory, right? So what we actually do is we give you several ones, and when you switch branches, it just keeps everything exactly the same state, but it just switches out the working directory. So it looks to you now as if you're in a new working directory. So basically, the branch in the repository and the working directory change simultaneously. And when you switch branches back again, you get your previous working directory and the previous branch in exactly the condition that it was in. And there's never any need to try and reconcile things before you do the branching. Other thoughts or questions? OK, I want to show you one other thing. Here's another little demo. Oh, it's an exciting day. So I want to show you what would happen if I edited these slides in PowerPoint rather than, oh, wait, that's not PowerPoint. Oh, sorry. That is really weird. What's going on here? Oh, no, it is PowerPoint. Sorry. I got confused. So can you see these little, it's a little hard to read, but can you see that I like to organize my slides into different subtopics? So there's a subtopic here called generics, which is in fact the subtopic I'm about to talk about. And there's a subject here that says uniformity. You probably can't read it, OK? And you can see that these can be opened and closed. So this is a very, very useful design feature, as you can imagine, right? Because it allows me to put some structure into my slideshow, OK? How many of you have used this feature of PowerPoint? How many of you have used PowerPoint? All right. So anyway, so the justification for this feature is, it's a very useful feature to have. Like if you're giving a lecture like this, you want to know exactly how many minutes you're going to take for each section. And you want to make sure you have coherent sections, right? So that you're not just sort of, dribbling on in some very long story, but you have small stories that are sort of put together in a coherent way. So it's really useful to have these sections. The question I have for you is this a good way to actually, is this a good concept? So we have here this concept of a section. Do you like this concept? Or is there something that might bother you about it? What do you think? So this is a great test since you've never seen this before. Are you pleased when you see this concept? Yeah, you're pleased because it gives you some functionality. If you were designing this, is this how you might have done it? Can you think of another way that you might have done it? You might tag the slides. Oh, that's an interesting one. You tag them by topic. Yeah, that would actually provide, that would serve a rather different purpose, right? Because then that could allow me, for example, to organize into content and exercises, where the exercises and the content are interleaved. It's a very interesting observation. Yes, that would be a very useful concept. But that's slightly different from structuring the overall structure in this way. But notice what's nice about that is that Jackson has suggested using a concept we're all already familiar with. He called it tag, but it's the same as label, right? Or category, or whatever you want to call it. So the reason he thought of that is, I was going to say he's not brilliant, but he probably is brilliant. But he's not so brilliant that he invented the notion of tagging on the spot, right? That notion was in his head because he's familiar with the concept of tagging, right? So is there a familiar concept that you might have used here for this one? Any ideas? Yes, in the back. Remind me of your name. Say it again. Erica.
I guess in file systems or in Finder, you have the set of directories and then
Beautiful. So Erica says, well, what about file systems? What about directories? What about a simple old hierarchy? And in fact, if you look at what you'll find in Keynote, so here's Keynote, that is exactly what you have. So let's actually look at the structure of these slides. So you can see here, there is exactly that. I can unfold a slide, and a slide behaves like a container. I can actually add another slide underneath, like this, and I can add another slide. Let's add another slide. And now I can move these into arbitrary levels of indentation. Can you see that? So there I've got this slide inside this slide, and this slide inside this slide. So that is a traditional folder hierarchy. So in short, what you would like to do is reuse rather than invent. And this is what Keynote did. And that concept, as Erica points out, is the concept of a directory hierarchy. And this is what PowerPoint did. And the cost of that is, first of all, that it's quite complicated because you need to add a whole load of special commands, right? In the case of Apple's design, all you have is this very simple command for nudging a slide in and out of the hierarchy. But now I've got to have a notion of add section, and I've got to wonder things like, well, what's that going to do? Is that going to take a second set of slides and put them in a section? Is it going to add a section after the slide, before this slide? There's a whole load of design complexity that comes with that, okay? And it's also a limiting concept. What are some of the things that you can't do in the PowerPoint design that you can do? There are at least two things that you can't do in the PowerPoint design that you can do in the Keynote design. What are they? Yes, Michael.
Subsections?
Yes, you can have arbitrary nesting in Keynote, right? You can go any number of, I don't know how many, probably not any number deep, but you can certainly have 3 or 4 deep. What else can you do in PowerPoint that you can't do in Keynote that you can't do in PowerPoint? Yes, Michael.
Basically have one defining slide that's the parent of the section.
Yes, you can do this nice thing where you make a slide the parent of a section. And one of the cute things you can do is if you don't want it to appear actually in the presentation, there's another concept of skipped slides. And in combination, the skipped slide structure and the hierarchical slide structure give you a lot of power. The skip slide serving the purpose of what shows and what doesn't show in the presentation, and the hierarchy giving you the structure. So what I'll typically do is I'll have a slide, you know, like this slide, which is my section header, right? And in these particular presentations, I'll show it, but sometimes I'll choose not to show it, okay? Okay, so where am I? I'm totally confused now. Okay, so in short, the idea is that different concepts get applied in different contexts. So take the concept of upvote, for example, where you can like or not like something, is applied to comments in the New York Times, or to answers in Stack Exchange, and to reviews in Amazon. Notifications, lots of different things you can get notifications for. The notion of being pointed to a related item, right? The New York Times does it for articles. Stack Exchange does it for questions with similar tags. Amazon does it for other items you might want to buy, right? And the point is that if you can reuse a concept rather than inventing it, then you save yourself the trouble of building it, right? Your users are delighted because they're already familiar with it. And then importantly, there are no surprises for anyone. There are no surprises for the user because they've seen it before, but there also aren't design surprises for you, the kinds of misfits we talked about, because you already know the limitations of that concept, right? So for example, and the other thing I want to say is that you know the space of design. So if we're talking, for example, about upvotes, right? The idea that you can like or not like. So if I said to you, why don't you consider upvotes in your 6170 final project, right? And I said to you, what kinds of options do you have? You don't need to start brainstorming about this entirely fresh design. You've all seen likes on all kinds of platforms, right? So you know what kinds of options there are. What kinds of things might you choose in how liking behaves? What are some of the design dimensions? Yeah, Jackson. Great. So Facebook has different kinds of liking, like, love, sad, or whatever. What else? Yes, Jonathan.
You don't really need a dislike button. You can just, a lot of systems have, you like it and then you like it again to.
Great. You can, so there are user interface design ideas that go with the concept, such as the idea that the button can be a toggle. So you don't need to have something that says, undo my like. Someone else was, yeah, Michael.
Sort of similar, whether you want to do it like Reddit style, so upvote and downvote, or just...
Exactly. Do you want to allow downvotes as well as upvotes? Great. What else? Costa, you had one.
No, I was just going to...
Okay. I'm going to say the same one. So all kinds of things. One of the questions is, who are you going to allow? What level of authentication do you need before people can do a like? Right? Do they have to be logged in, or can they be anyone? How are you going to count, what counts as a unique like? Are you going to, if you're not going to log them in, are you going to look at their IP address? Are you going to look at some session cookie so that if they open another tab, they can like in the other tab? Lots and lots of options, but the point is, You know all these things. So when you say I'm going to use the upvoting concept, it comes with all this knowledge, and that's why it's valuable. Okay, so in summary, this is what we've talked about today. We've talked about the one-to-one rule, and which is really, in a sense, just about purpose being central. It's really saying when you design concepts, you should know what your purpose is. And there was one bit that I think is very surprising, which is this idea that you want a concept to deliver only one purpose. As became clear in our discussion about system labels, all these heuristics have limits. These are not hard and fast rules. So sometimes it's the case that a concept can successfully deliver two purposes, but you should always be wary of that. And then we talked about uniformity and genericity, and I'm pretty sure you knew about this already. What I hope is that this gave you a way to sort of put it into a framework that will allow you to put it into practice and apply it in your own work. Okay? So that's it at sort of the conceptual level of design. Next week, we're going to start talking about user interface design. So see you then.